I can hear my guests. I can see my guests, and so could you, because we're streaming this show on Facebook and YouTube. You just search KUOW Public Radio. I can see everyone on Zoom except Washington State Wire founder and publisher DJ Wilson. DJ, you're audio only for now. Hi there.
Hello, Bill, and I'm here as a testament to the joy of technology in these pandemic times.
Well, on the positive side, thanks to technology, I can see South Seattle Emerald founder and publisher and Seattle Times columnist Marcus Green. Hey, Marcus.
Hey, Bill. Great to be reunited with you.
Great to be reunited with you. And I can see Tacoma News Tribune reporter Chase Hutchinson. Chase, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. Good to be here.
And welcome to March, by the way. This is it is slowly getting warmer and lighter. The sun sets at 6 p.m. tonight, sort of a landmark. Is this, I wondered if this is changing anybody's mood. Are any of you sunset sensitive?
I will just say, yes, absolutely. We're days away from days being longer than nights, and I love it. This is now that we're in March, we're days away from my Gonzaga Bulldogs about to run through the NCAA tournament. So that's also awesome.
They haven't lost yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Don't jinx
it. Sorry, just jinxed it. How about you, Chase or Marcus? Are you light sensitive? Is this happy times for you?
I am not light sensitive, but I definitely enjoy my sleep. So, I am not looking forward to losing an hour, I must say, but c'est la vie.
Yeah, this is in 9 days. We set our clocks forward. So now it's sunsetting at about 7 o'clock, but I'm with you, Marcus. I don't think it's warm enough to luxuriate in that extra evening daylight. And Chase, you're nodding your head. And yet when I'm trying to get up, I try to run in the morning and get going, it's dark again. So I'm depressed, but I'm happy if you're happy. Chase, happy springtime almost.
Yeah, I'm also depressed and haven't gotten a good night of sleep since the beginning of the pandemic, so maybe this will change it.
Well, let's get to some pandemic talk. You knew we would as we cover the news this week. We had a vaccine reversal this week with Governor Inslee. For weeks he's been saying no, teachers and school staff cannot move up ahead in the line for COVID vaccinations. But then this week, the White House said do it, and Inslee said he had no choice.
This was a decision by President Biden. I disagreed with it. I thought it was imperative that we keep access to these vaccines to the group that's in the most dangerous category, and that's older folks.
Remember when President Trump would tell Washington to do something and the state would refuse and sue him? Not so. Inslee went along with it. Educators are now getting COVID shots. That does not mean they're all returning to schools now. The Seattle Teachers Union voted no confidence in the district's reopening plans. Marcus, do you know what it is that Seattle teachers are still concerned about?
Yeah, a lot of them feel that there hasn't been, or I should say that there's been a lack of communication in terms of what the safety protocols are going to be. And that, there's one thing to say, we want you back. There's another thing to say, okay, how are we actually going to do that? There are still questions, right, that we don't know about COVID and some of the vaccinations that even, when you are vaccinated, you can still potentially pass on the coronavirus to a loved one who isn't a teacher and it may not, be first in line to get a vaccine. And so for many teachers, it's like you have not adequately answered our questions in terms of what are going to be the safety protocols if we do re-enter these buildings. And then number two, they feel that these things should be bargained in terms of going back into the school, as opposed to what some teachers unfortunately have been labeled as essential workers. And they feel that that is a way to sort of circumvent what should be negotiated and bargained with between the school districts and teachers.
Yeah, in Seattle, the district says they have a memo of understanding that says they can do that. The teachers filed an unfair labor practice charge. So there's that debate. So I understand Marcus was mentioning the vaccines are not a complete panacea, but on the topic of safety protocols, how, whether the schools are, whether the airflow is good enough and whether all the protections are there, the cleaning and the masks. I don't know how good the communication has been, but I don't understand how a year into the pandemic, there could be a lack of planning for safety protocols. Chase, do you know anything about how that's possible?
I was going to chime in to say it's a problem facing districts everywhere. I cover the Peninsula School District, and their teachers union had held a no confidence vote of their superintendent for those exact reasons. They felt like there was a breakdown in communication. I imagine it's because they've been trying to push ahead, and that there's still a lot of uncertainty about the information as to what exactly is the best thing to do. They have been trying to improve their airflow. They've been trying to increase mask usage. They've been trying to take all these steps, but there's still just a lot of uncertainty, especially with high schools coming back. It's a different ball game. It's very different than middle school or elementary school, and it brings a lot of uncertainty that districts think that they can only figure out by doing, and that for some teachers is a bridge too far, because there's just so much that they don't know and so much that they haven't been able to be ensured that they'll get vaccines. Because in the event that vaccines get distributed within this week, you might not get your second dose by the end of March.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point too about elementary versus high school. DJ Wilson, anything to add on this kind of limbo that we're in now? DJ, I'm not hearing you, so I'm going to let you fiddle with the mic. I know we're having some tech issues. So Seattle is trying to ramp up, and they're trying to get teachers vaccinated. So, and Chase, I hear you saying we don't know that all teachers are even going to get vaccinated by the time school is supposed to end. Is it that bad?
Based on the timing that I've sort of done in my head, that if there's a period of time where you have to wait to get your second dose and you haven't gotten it as soon as you possibly can, because there still is a lot of tricky things in getting appointments. Some districts have been setting up clinics or said they're going to set up clinics at the school to try and increase that. But the big question that really is outstanding is, will we know when all teachers and staff have the vaccines? The district I cover told me that they aren't going to be tracking that information, and that's pretty common. There was an AP story today that a lot of districts or schools aren't going to be providing that information. So it won't be even something that we can entirely verify unless they begin tracking that data.
DJ, let's see if we can hear you yet. You want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think I've figured out some of my problems. We'll see.
Gotcha.
I would just underscore that, in Washington State, this really is a local issue, and each of the districts have to figure this out on their own. And that means each of the unions have to be at the table and communicate. And I think what you're seeing is in part a real kind of residual fear, a residual concern of folks who have been told for 12 months, hey, you could get sick if you step outside. And this is an example of how difficult it's going to be when we all have to make individual and community level decisions to try to figure out how to come back to normal. And I think it's going to be some time. This is not going to be the last time we talk about this, but when we start thinking about things like having birthday parties, or when we think about things like going to the movies, or we think about things like, are we going to watch Seahawks games, or not that anybody watches Mariners games, but maybe Sounders games. Yeah, how do we get together as community? And so this is, I think, the front edge of some of that.
And DJ, you missed St. Patrick's Day, obviously coming up.
Right.
Smart things happen around that holiday. So.
That's true.
Seattle's 2 new permanent vaccination sites saw their first patients this week. The sites at Rainier Beach and West Seattle are designed to attract seniors from minority groups that are showing more exposure to coronavirus. James Roberson got his shot Monday at Rainier Beach after he got an email from a community group that he trusted.
Well, before I was thinking it may take a while for me to get in. I'm over 60, but it's been so hard to get in, so I've been waiting a bit. However, I found out that Rainier Beach really wants to get people of color vaccinated, so I took another stab at it, was able to get in.
I have not seen the latest numbers on this. Does anyone know how Washington State's demographics of who's getting vaccinated compare to other states? Or is that just unknowable still?
No, we still lag an equitable response insofar as white people continue to get vaccinated at higher rates. People of higher income continue to get vaccinated at higher rates than other demographics in the state. That is common across the country. We're not unique in that, unfortunately. And there are some, structural reasons why that is the case. People who are caregivers are often better educated. People of color have fewer opportunities to get educated. So that's sort of like a long-term thing. And then, I think you're seeing some relationship
elements kind of poke out here, just like the interviewed guest just spoke to. He heard from a community group, and some communities are getting information out to their people more rapidly than others. And but I would note that on the good side, Washington State is one of the earliest states to have now vaccinated, at least with the first dose, more of its residents than it has had infected. So we have more people now vaccinated than we've had infected, and we were the 6th state in the country to be able to hit that mark, which is kind of a good sign.
Assuming we know how many people have been infected.
Well, there's that too, a problem of the data there for sure.
Yeah. Well, Texas ended their mask mandate. You think it's going to ripple to Washington? Locals here seeing other people breathing free and wanting to do the same? Or are we just too different?
Unlikely. I think all the messaging and all of the people masking up is going to continue for the foreseeable future. I don't anticipate us following in Texas's footsteps anytime soon. That would be probably the shock of the pandemic if something like that were to happen.
Yeah, I think you might see some ex-Seattleite, Pats who moved to Texas. They might come back and to migrate to the Northwest. I know that's in speaking to my aunt and uncle who moved to Texas about a year ago, they were like, we are completely just done with this place. So and they're coming back to Seattle. So
oh, really? They're coming back?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so just to wrap up, I heard just in our newscast a moment ago, you do have some Republicans wanting all businesses in Washington open at 50% capacity by the end of March. All schools would have to be in person. And then after 3 weeks, all the COVID restrictions would be lifted unless hospitalizations spike. Our state secretary of health said it's too soon to say that. Meanwhile, the governor's laying out the phases of getting vaccinated. We go to phase 1B2 on March 22nd. That's right. It'll be on everyone's lips, 1B2. So we've got grocery store workers, food processing plants, jails, prisons, bus drivers, first responders eligible to be vaccinated. People 16 and older who are pregnant or have a disability that puts them at higher risk. And then vaccine eligibility just keeps rolling out from there. Speaking of the pandemic, as we're covering the news of the week here, the city of Seattle has been letting people camp in public areas even more than before during the pandemic. But this week, the city did clear campers out of the oldest park in town. Sean Murphy had been living at Denny Park for about a week. He said he got cleared away. He says he's on a wait list for housing. And in the meantime, he is hesitant to go to a shelter because of COVID and other concerns.
I would rather live in a tent on my own than be in a shelter where you're just jamming a bunch of people in with all of the emotional stress that comes with it. You don't really realize it until you come from the mainstream world into this world that, wow, feeling safe is a real big, important deal. And it's not a given.
So at last we talked to Murphy. He was not inside. He had just moved his tent to a different park. Does anyone here think that this Denny Park sweep signals a new city policy, or where do we? This has been so back and forth. Should police be involved? Should people be moved on in a pandemic? So I'm a little unsure where we are now. Any opinions on the panel?
I think one thing.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Chase. No, go ahead.
I think it represents an extension of previous policy, but obviously, as the voice we just heard said, there's no real way to distance in the same way most of us can in a shelter. And that's something we've seen echoed throughout different groups saying that they're concerned that people being taken off the streets or away from where they might be living and then put into a shelter is not a sustainable option for them. So I think it definitely represents an extension of previous policy, but the fact that there are new strains, new spreading potential, that is something that will need to be kind of taken into account when it comes to whether these sweeps are a good idea in the future.
Interestingly, on the point of the COVID virus, it does appear that homeless populations, according to the data, have a much lower rate of spread than the population as a whole, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about this too is that the politics of homelessness are just increasingly polarizing. So you're seeing cities like Mercer Island and other suburban ring cities begin to have these conversations framed within the "we don't want to be Seattle" kind of frame. And, I think Seattle clearly has a poor track record on homelessness. There's just no two ways around it. And I think part of that is based, I don't know, but I think part of that is based is in that the people who are trying to fix the problem don't often have the lived experience of the people who have been homeless. Like that gentleman that just spoke, to say that it's scarier for him or less secure for him to be in a shelter than it is to be on the street. That is not a talking point for creating more shelters. Like, that's not fabulous. It says that our system is, the thing that we're spending so much money and investing in, is not working. So, and when we see that, President Trump makes Seattle as sort of like the poster child of bad behavior on some of this stuff, it's not just the suburbs, it's Eastern Washington, it's Southwest Washington, it's other parts of our state are now looking to Seattle saying, whatever we do on homelessness, we want to not do it that way.
Marcus, anything to add?
No, I mean, other than kind of echoing what's already been said, is that, I mean, I think people start to look at Seattle's policy over these past few years and all of the money that has gone towards these homelessness policies, and they look at it like we're simply just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic after a while, right? I mean, where is this actually heading? It doesn't seem to be any place that is productive.
In a moment on Week in Review, we're going to get into what the state legislature is doing. We're going to start with it's possibly restricting police use of force tactics. So that's coming up next. We've got Marcus Green here from South Seattle Emerald, DJ Wilson from the Washington State Wire, Chase Hutchinson with Tacoma News Tribune, and we will be right back. Stay tuned.
94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Some apes at the San Diego Zoo have been given an experimental COVID vaccine after a troop of gorillas tested positive for the virus. You'll hear more about that today during BBC NewsHour, which begins this afternoon at 1 o'clock.
Support for KUOW comes from King Conservation District, whose board members work to promote local food, healthy forests, and clean water. Board elections are being held now through March 23rd. More information at kingcd.org/vote.
48 degrees and rainy in Seattle. It's 12:24, and it's KUOW's Week in Review.
This is Bill Radke looking in on Facebook and YouTube here. You can search KUOW Public Radio. DJ Wilson has joined the visuals, and we've got Chase Hutchinson here and Marcus Green, and we're figuring out what happened this week and what it means. 1 year ago this week, Tacoma police officers killed Manny Ellis, handcuffed him, held him down. Ellis suffocated. The medical examiner ruled it a homicide. Ellis's sister, Monet Carter Mixon, said police cannot keep getting away with this.
If it wasn't for me and Manny's friend screaming at the top of our lungs and George Floyd dying, this would have got brushed under the rug. And they all need to be held accountable, specifically those 2 police officers that murdered my brother.
Manny Ellis's death was one of the cases cited by State Representative Jesse Johnson as he sponsored a statewide ban on police chokeholds and neck restraints.
And we have witnessed the evidence of unnecessary police violence and tactics that has produced negative outcomes predominantly for communities of color.
Marcus, if this ban had been in effect a year ago and Manny Ellis was killed, do we know what would have happened to those Tacoma officers?
We don't know, to be honest with you. And I mean, and don't get me wrong, I'm very, supportive of these type of bans, but all you have to do is look at the case of Eric Garner, who was the Black New Yorker who was killed by it ended up being killed by a New York police officer when the New York police officer applied a chokehold to him, and he ended up cutting off his air pathways there. At the time, it should be noted that chokehold was actually illegal, and yet the police officer still applied it to him. And so I think ultimately, yes, these bills are important. It's important to ban these chokeholds and so forth. It's also very important to apply some level of severe punishment, when these things have been violated by police. And I think that's the thing that a lot of accountability advocates are saying, is that it isn't even so much I mean, as important, obviously, as these bans and so forth are, it's also important the punishment that comes with them. It can't be a slap on the wrist.
I was going
Chase,
to
to
chime
hold
in off of
officers.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Chase.
With House Bill 1202, that's kind of the teeth that I think you're referring to that proponents say needs to happen. And House Bill 1202 would eliminate qualified immunity and make it so that there's a lower threshold to holding police accountable on what people identify as excessive use of force in instances like with Manny Ellis and others. So proponents are pushing for that to be the thing because they want to obviously place limitations on the use of force. But in the event that gets violated or broken, what is then the next legal recourse that citizens can have? And that's largely the discussion being had right now.
Exactly, Chase, because they're saying essentially that you can't give people extraneous power over other individuals in our society without giving them extraneous accountability. And I think that's what, again, House Bill 1202 does that.
But Chase, to hold officers accountable, that accountability process has to work. What did the Manny Ellis killing tell us about how accountability works in Washington?
That it's a very fraught process and has a lot of flaws. Based on the fact that we only just a couple months ago learned that there was actually a fifth officer who was there and assisted in restraining Mr. Ellis is a problem that activists and community members have pointed to as a lack of transparency. That originally it was the sheriff's office that was looking into this, but when it was revealed that there was someone from their office there, it was transferred over to the Washington State Patrol, who began looking into this process. But all of the police officers who were there haven't spoken to the Washington State Patrol. A lot of their information has come from the medical examiner, who declined to be recorded, but there are notes that have been received from that. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And this specific case has brought into focus a lot of the lack of transparency that people have been concerned about for a long time.
We haven't talked yet about no-knock warrants, which are a part of this bill as well. Any sense of how effective that is? Is it controversial? Is it important to this measure?
I think in many cases it is, with the example of Breonna Taylor bringing that into focus of how much can go wrong in the event of a no-knock warrant. The problem is also that a knock warrant is not hugely different from a no-knock warrant. You can wait 30 seconds after declaring yourself. Someone could be half asleep, groggy, waking up. That has people concerned as well. There are some people that specifically push back that they think they still need a no-knock warrant. I spoke to a police chief who said that they still want it as a tool in their toolbox, even as it's only been used one time when I talked to him. But activists say that there need to be some limitations on what can and can't be done, that a no-knock warrant only can create the type of thing that puts individuals in danger, police officers in danger, like with Breonna Taylor, where it can just escalate out of control way too quickly.
Republican legislator Brad Clippert, who is a sheriff's deputy, said that these restrictions on the use of force would go too far.
When you take away the less lethal tools, now you're telling that law enforcement officer, you can't use that. All you've got left is a lethal tool.
DJ, do you have any sense how likely this measure is to become law? DJ, I'm not hearing you again. Whatever you were doing before was working.
I can chime in on that.
Yeah, okay.
There have been a lot of amendments that have been introduced because that's the way the legislative process works. It's often a push and pull. So there were specific things like tear gas being removed as something that would be limited to where police departments can still use tear gas, even as that's a controversial tactic, as we saw in Seattle. And so there has been a push and pull. I think there's a good chance that the legislation could pass. It just is a question of in what form, after what amendments and what changes and what compromise has been had amongst the differing interests.
I think I'm back now, Bill. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
I think the question is whether this gets a little momentum for Saturday. Saturday is a big day in the legislature where the last votes will be held that are on the more contentious stuff. Not the last votes, because they have till Tuesday to vote, but to move things out of the House of Origin. 1202 is not yet scheduled for a vote, but it's got, I think I'm looking at it, 15 amendments already lined up, which tells me there's probably going to be a vote. I think one of the things that's interesting is less about the Republican concerns and really more about the diversity of opinion within the Democratic caucus, particularly the House Democratic caucus, because you have some very strong advocates like Representative Johnson and others. And then you have some other folks who, want to take a little more middling path. And then you've got some folks who want a little more, frankly, a little more credit for some of these things that are not getting some of the credit. And so the caucus dynamics on this one will actually be one of the toughest tests for our new speaker that she has had in the whole session. It will be this set of public safety reforms. This was identified as one of the top two or the two number one tier priority topics for the House Democrats in particular, Senate Democrats also. And behind the scenes, there's just a little bit of sausage making going on where not all the votes are fully lined up as far as we can tell.
Okay, so that's police tactics. What about, DJ, what about the qualified immunity bill that we talked about a moment ago?
Yeah, I mean, I would say union politics are tricky in the Democratic caucus, and I think it's to be seen. The police union in Seattle has been ejected from the King County Labor Council, and so there's a little bit of less protection there. But I think it remains to be seen how this is going to go, and we'll know probably Saturday.
Okay, let's talk about some other business in Olympia that could affect some folks, the lucky folks, I guess, because in Washington State, people whose investments make them money, called capital gains, they don't pay a tax on that money, and that might change. This goes up for a Senate vote tomorrow, I believe, thanks to supportive lawmakers like Joe Nguyen.
This bill enacts a capital gains excise fee on a very small amount of people in Washington State. And I believe that we are responsible not just for the budget here, but also for being stewards of the economy as well, which means we need to make investments in Washington State. So I urge your support.
Wait a second, Senator. You said this bill enacts what?
This bill enacts a capital gains excise fee on a
No. It's not an excise fee. This is an income tax, according to Republican opponent Senator John Braun.
This is, by all definitions, other than that in the bill, an income tax, which is graduate income tax, as you know, Mr. President, is unconstitutional based on longstanding precedent.
Okay, that's the argument. Capital gains tax is an income tax, unconstitutional. DJ, who's right?
Well, it certainly depends on who you talk to.
Darn, I was hoping if I just said it in 2 words, who's right, then the answer would be just as simple and obvious.
By definition, an excise tax is a tax on a transaction. And Democrats argue that a capital gains excise tax is only realized upon the execution of a transaction. So you have to sell some capital. Capital, like real estate, has to change hands. And when we do that with real estate, we actually call it a real estate excise tax. We don't call it a real estate income tax. In Washington State, our Constitution says that you cannot tax property at different levels. And that essentially the 1% is the cap on a tax of property unless there's a vote of the people. And this is why we get into things like education funding and school levies, and it gets really complicated. And there's a 1% threshold there. The Grange brought a lawsuit back in the 1930s that resulted in the Washington State Grange that resulted in income being identified as property for Washington State legal purposes. And as a consequence, you cannot, under current interpretation of the Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court's current interpretation, current precedent of the constitutional reading is that you cannot therefore tax income at a level greater than 1% because it is like property, and property is limited in our Constitution. So what this bill is about, in part, is actually bringing a new lawsuit to the Supreme Court, specifically to get the Supreme Court to revisit this. And this has been a dream of progressives for generations, is to get a lawsuit that would bring the right legal questions framed in the right way that would allow to unlink or decouple income from property tax. So it is, according to public records, it is clear that some of the legislators, particularly in the Senate, folks like Senator Jamie Peterson, who's very well versed and very smart on this stuff, could be one of our next attorney general candidates in the years ahead. Peterson wants very clearly to call the question before the Supreme Court about whether income is property. And so part of this legislation, a key piece, is actually to get to the Supreme Court. Regressivity is a big deal in Washington State. People argue about that a little bit. but Washington State is
regressivity, meaning that in Washington State, the poor pay relatively more in taxes than the rich do.
Yeah, just a sort of comment, like if how this works. And when we think about tax policy, if you tax everybody the same percentage of their income, like everybody pays 20% of their income, that is a neutral tax. It's neither progressive or regressive. If you tax everybody 10% of the things they purchase, like a sales tax, somebody who has $40,000 a year is going to spend all of their money on food and things that they're going to get taxed on. Somebody that has $40 million is only going to spend part of it. Like, they might only spend $300,000. And so the percent of tax on the income of the poorer cohort is much higher. It's not quite 100%, but it's well over 50%. Well, it's well below 2%, it turns out, in Washington State. What I mean by that is when you compare all of the states in the country, everyone and the District of Columbia, Texas is the second most regressive tax system in the country. They don't have an income tax. The poor there are taxed higher than any place else in the country except for one state. The highest income cohort are taxed the lowest in Texas of any state in the country except for one state. And that one state is Washington. So if you're rich, you get a better deal in Washington in terms of state and local taxes. If you're poor, you get a worse deal than even Texas. And so that has led to some of the greatest income inequality. By some measures, Washington State is the most unequal state in the country. You've got Bill Gates and you've got Mennonite populations. We have the third highest number of homeless people in Washington State. So part of what this capital gains tax is attempting to do on the part of, if you ask Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans, is to address the fact that we have the best possible place in the country if you're in the 1% in terms of state and local taxes, and the worst possible place in the country if you're in the bottom 20% for state and local taxes.
Right.
Go
ahead.
I was going to chime in on that, where I think what's motivating this is a lot of what you were alluding to, which is that oftentimes it's not just more difficult to be poor, it can be more expensive to be poor. It can, in a time of crisis, mean that rather than investing in something that can be better for your health or longevity, you have to deal with a crisis in that moment. And that can be very expensive and then also not a long-term fix, but is all you can afford. But then you end up having to go through these crisis moments of paying it again and again. And I think that's what's motivating a lot of these reforms that are trying to be put into place to balance things out, that in the midst of a crisis that has most disproportionately impacted people that are poor, that's what people are hoping can begin to push back on some of those things, that when we come out of a pandemic, there can be a little bit more of a fairer tax code.
And I'll just only add that, I mean, we do see that during this pandemic, there have been places like New Jersey who do have a capital gains tax, who were able to avoid, some deeper cuts, which they, projected that they might have to do during this pandemic, because they have a capital gains tax, and because the folks there who were more fortunate, there it should be said that there's only, I want to say 90% of our stocks are held by people who are in the 10%. Top 10% income bracket. They were able to essentially undergird their economy, and they didn't suffer as much. And so I think that you see places like Washington who have seen that, and they're like, well, maybe that's replicable, here in our state.
Well, this, as written currently, this capital gains tax would, if it holds up in court, et cetera, would affect about, I think it's 7,000 or 8,000 Washingtonians. My question is, would this just be a shifting of the tax burden to make it more progressive, but it's the same overall amount of money raised in taxes? Or would this also be a tax increase without being offset by tax decreases in other places? Do we know that yet?
Yeah, the idea, I mean, we'll see what happens on the floor tomorrow, but the idea is that this would be a tax increase without equal offsets. And there are a lot of reasons for that amongst House Democrats and Senate Democrats. Part of the reason is this regressivity clause that we talked about. Part of it is you want to have funding, adequate funding for programs to support folks who are near the bottom of the income bracket. there is, I think, this poverty tax or poverty premium that Chase alludes to is an important thing also, which is just, like if you're in a crisis and you can't pay your credit card bill, you get a fine, you get a fee associated with not paying your bill 1 month. That adds up to more costs for people who are at lower income. So when you just go through all kinds of things, whether it was the clean fuel standard legislation that passed out of the House last Saturday, which was also a really interesting and innovative bill, that actually is arguably very regressive because people at the lower end of the income bracket are going to pay more in taxes. People in rural economies who are generally poorer than people in urban economies are going to pay a higher percent of that tax. So it's interesting that for as much as the regressivity conversation is about or is wrapped into this capital gains conversation, you're not seeing an offsetting reduction in the state sales tax, which would help regressivity. You're seeing at the same time increases in gas tax that are hurting this regressivity argument. So it does lack for a kind of a through thread through all this fiscal policy making that actually is coherent. It's like every little one of these steps adds up in different ways to something that has less cohesiveness.
But
Okay,
DJ,
if the capital, yes, go ahead, Marcus.
I was just gonna say, DJ, isn't one of the reasons why that might be there isn't any offset for particularly for this capital gains tax is that it is linked to the market, and we do know that the market can be very volatile. So maybe it's hard to project revenue that would come from this.
It's a great point. And it's exactly right that actually capital gains is not a good policy, a good fiscal policy if you're trying to build operational income consistency, because you have these boom and busts, to Marcus's point. In this economy, in this recession, people who are at the top of the income bracket are making a killing. In the last recession, people who own real estate and who were at the top end also got hurt, and capital gains fell considerably. In a state like Oregon, where they have a capital gains excise tax, they joke down there in the legislature that it depends on what Uncle Phil does, meaning Phil Knight. When Phil Knight sells stock, it shows up in the Oregon capital or in the Oregon general fund budget because of the way it's set. It's just a few people that get hit, and it can be $500,000 of extra money that shows up because Phil Knight sells some stock.
Yeah, what did Jeff do today? What did Bill do today? Okay,
Exactly.
If the capital gains tax clears the legislature and goes into law, it will be challenged in court, and that's part of the idea. So continuing on that vein, we'll discuss this, and we'll take a short break. And this capital gains tax money would in part pay for childcare. And so I want to talk about something else the legislature, Marcus is going to tell us about something the legislature's doing to help when it comes to childcare when we return on Week in Review.
94.9 KUOW Seattle. In international news, Brazil's Supreme Federal Court has ordered an investigation into the sale of protected areas of the Amazon rainforest on Facebook. You'll hear more about that today during BBC NewsHour, which begins at 1 o'clock.
Support for KUOW comes from the state of Washington. The Department of Health's online Phase Finder tool can provide information on who is currently eligible to get the COVID vaccine, as well as text or email notifications when a new group becomes eligible for the vaccine. More at findyourphasewa.org.
50 degrees and rainy in Seattle. It's 12:46, and it's KUOW's Week in Review.
You are with News Tribune reporter Chase Hutchinson, Washington State Wire publisher DJ Wilson, and South Seattle Emerald publisher and Seattle Times columnist Marcus Green. I'm Bill Radke, and we're all of us up on Facebook and YouTube. If you want to watch that way, just search KUOW Public Radio. So we were just talking about this capital gains tax that would in part go to pay for childcare for working parents. Meanwhile, Marcus, you are watching another bill that would help people who are doing the child care themselves. Would you tell us about this?
Yeah, so it's SB 5151. It's attempting to address what is essentially a two-tiered child welfare system that we have here in Washington State. So basically what we have now is that if you are a foster parent, meaning that you have went through the licensing process to become a foster parent, you get and you're trying to raise, let's say, 2 children, you would essentially at the very least get about $1,200 a month to raise those 2 children. You contrast that with what people are colloquially calling kinship caregivers. There are essentially 47,000 of them in our state, and they're largely grandmothers and largely people of color who are raising their grandchildren. The only access they have to financial resources or support at the statewide level is through TANF, which is temporary assistance for needy families, which if you're raising 2 children equates to only $459 a month. Now,
and Marcus, I just want to highlight that so you're saying 47,000. That's far more kinship caregivers than there are foster caregivers in.
Yes, for every 1 child in the foster care who's being raised by a relative, there are 11 children outside of the system. So vastly more numbers. That being said, DCYF, the Department of Child and Youth and Family, they're essentially what used to be Child Protective Services and the Child Welfare Services in the state. They've been trying for the longest to collapse that discrepancy, and then 2, get more kinship caregivers into the foster system. The big problem with that is that there has been a long-standing history, and I'll be quite blunt, especially in the Black community, with the state being involved at all within the households of kinship caregivers. When I was doing the reporting on this article, and I know it's anecdotal, but there was a kinship caregiver who needed the money and so she went into the foster care system. She had been raising her child, or her grandchild, who she calls her child, for 12 years. About a year into being a foster parent, there's an incident that happened, and Child Protective Services took the child, not only took the child away from her, but also put that child with a family who the woman went to church with. And so, not only did she have the pain, right, of losing her child, but seeing her with a different family, every week in church, right, which also had some psychological, damage and trauma on the child. And so I think this is a situation where people are saying, yeah, I need the money, but I'd rather go it alone, as opposed to having the state have say so over this child that I'm raising. And you have now with Senate Bill 5151, DCYF is essentially allow for DCYF to have what they're calling a child-only license, which means a kinship caregiver would not have to take on other children into their house. They would essentially be licensed just for that child. And so even though they would have to go through a licensing process, it wouldn't necessarily be as invasive as many of kinship caregivers are saying the current foster licensing system and protocol is. And they're saying, quite frankly, that it's long overdue. Washington is one of only 4 states that has this disparity in what they give to foster parents versus what they give to kinship care parents. So again, I mean, this is sort of another thing that sort of belies the state's sort of progressive reputation, if you will.
I'm going to let my other panelists either ask a question of Marcus, who's really tracking this, or maybe you have a comment yourself. I have one more question for now, Marcus, which is, why do you think this bill has advanced this far now? Has something changed?
Yeah, I think there are multiple factors. One, I do think that you have a more overall progressive and diverse legislature here in Washington State. When I was talking to Senator Claire Wilson, who's the primary sponsor on this bill, she said that she thinks that people are now legislating a little bit more via lived experience. And I think this is also something, to be quite blunt with you, there are just more kinship caregivers who are white because of the opiate crisis. There are a lot of families now who are being raised by children who are being raised by their grandparents because of the opiate crisis. It's very similar to what happened when the crack cocaine crisis hit, the Black community. And I think, when I was talking to LaShonda Pittman, she's a University of Washington professor who specializes in grandparents raising grandchildren. She was saying, when it was just Black grandparents, quite frankly, who were raising their grandchildren, and people wanted to demean their children as crackheads, you didn't get a ton of support, right, for kinship caregivers. But now, quite frankly, that this is infected and are touching, into white suburban households. Now you're getting, more of a more proponents around this. And, she says, we don't call, these kids entering into the system oxytots, and we shouldn't demean them. But it's just kind of a continued history, right, of asymmetric compassion, depending on, whose families are impacted and whose families are not impacted by certain crises.
Any other questions or just a commentary on this from Chase or DJ?
I was just going to echo basically everything you just said and say that's an important reason why not just political officials, when looking at these issues, need to hear from the people themselves, but the journalists reporting and covering on it. Because for the people that are experiencing this, it's something they've known for generations. They've known that there's this asymmetrical compassion, that Washington's progressive reputation extends only so far, and that if you just look at what the official statements are, you can miss a lot of people that are really hurting and struggling. And so it seems like this is the type of issue, and reading your reporting, I think you really cut through to some of those issues. So mainly just everything you said.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you made there at the end, Marcus, about the asymmetrical compassion. Really good stuff. I also think it's worth noting that this is a good example of why it's really important to have good people leading agencies, and you have to have the right structure for good government to work. So in this case, Ross Hunter has been at DCYF for a little while now. And Ross Hunter I think he deserves a lot of credit for how he's leading that agency. It is a new agency. It's been carved out of DSHS. I think former DSHS Secretary Kevin Quigley deserves a lot of credit. He came in 2013 at the beginning of Inslee's term in office, and one of his primary goals was to carve out children and family services into its own agency so they could focus on families and kids. And there are a lot of policies that have been baked into how we take care of kids, which fail kids over and over and over and over again, including the kids that need the most from us. We do the least for repeatedly. And there's been good reporting on that. But I think Ross Hunter deserves a lot of praise here.
Marcus, I would have, if you had just told me, because I hadn't followed this issue, if you just said caregivers who are, let's say, grandparents get far less money to take care of kids than foster parents, I would have said, well, yeah, I guess that's because you have to pay someone more to take care of a stranger's kids than your own kids. I hear you telling me that is quite an ignorant take on what's really operating here.
Well, that too, but I also think, right, you have to ask, what is the true objective of our child welfare system, right? It's the well-being of the child, right? If that is the case, if that is the case, right, we know that a child does better if let's say their biological parents are out of the picture for whatever reason. We know that a child does better raised by a relative than they do a stranger. We know that they are more likely to stay out of trouble when it comes to the criminal justice system. They're more likely to complete college, and they are more likely, right, to go on and to to an actual career where they're quote unquote a model citizen. So I mean, I think if we want to really end things like our prison to school pipeline, if we want to end things like not just disproportionality within our child welfare system, but disproportionality within things like school expulsions and elsewhere, then I think we need to really focus on foundationally changing how we approach our child welfare system. And I think 5151 is a step in the right direction.
You know what happens next with this bill?
It did pass out of the House, and so it passed out of the Senate, and I believe it is now just awaiting a vote in the House. Okay. We'll see.
Okay, thanks for that. We just have enough time left on Week in Review to actually smile at something. And this week I read in the Seattle Met magazine about the Seattle celebrities who were on Cameo, which is the site where you pay money to have famous people leave you a personalized greeting. Like for $275, someone named Selena got a hello from this Seattle-born hornist.
Hi, Selena, it's Kenny G here. I'm in my studio, but I'm thinking about you because it's your birthday. Happy birthday to you. This is from your husband, Ron, and he reached out to me, and also from your business partner, Danny Chow. Those boys and me want you to have a great birthday. I know you've been working really hard lately, so I think this is your time to take the day to do what you want, and let's start it off with me playing saxophone just for you, Selena. Here's a song. I hope you enjoy it. It's called Loving You.
There it is. There's the Kenny Genus. So you can get a greeting from Gary Payton from the Sonics, or Jewel Lloyd of the Seattle Storm, or a singer, or Mary Lambert. And this makes me smile because my personal lack of interest in Cameo, I feel, just saved me $275. But is there a Seattle celeb who you would pay to say your name? Anybody?
Well, let me just jump in to say, Bill, my daughter turns 6 today. Can you maybe wish her happy birthday? Her name's Mari.
Name, DJ? Mari.
Her name's Mari.
Mari. Hello, Mari. Hi, it's happy birthday to you. You know, your dad loves you very much. Let me play you a little Kenny G riff, if I may.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
There you go. I have a better idea. I'm an entrepreneur here. You pay for 5 minutes on the phone with a celebrity, because it takes them 5 minutes to make your recording anyway. It's not that much more of a lift to be like, to get to ask Stevie Wonder 2 questions, or, you know, or tell them how much Intervision's meant to you, or whatever. Like I think that's the next big, huge idea. But anyway, we're almost out of time. Anything making anybody else smile this week?
Yeah, I'll say, you know, I actually, we had to put down our dog on last Sunday, and a Chihuahua Dotson, who I've talked about before on the show.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful line off the last episode of WandaVision that not only to me encapsulated, you know, letting my dog go, but also letting 2020 go and this time period that we have. But it said, what is grief if not love persevering? And it just made me very happy because really loved my dog.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marcus. I'm glad you have that love to feel, you know, even when it doesn't feel good. Anything else, Chase, DJ? Any smiles? We're just about out of time.
I was just gonna say, getting to join all you lovely people and have this important conversation. Can't top
Thank
what
you,
was
Chase.
just said either.
And DJ's kid is having a birthday, so there's
that.
May you have a wonderful, wonderful birthday. That's our time, actually, on the Week in Review. I want to thank Marcus Green from South Seattle Emerald and the Seattle Times, DJ Wilson of Washington State Wire, and Mari, and Chase Hutchinson with Tacoma